Thank you very much for that introduction. So the title of my talk is Sticks and Stones May Break My Bones, but Can Words Hurt My Brain? And it's a slightly provocative title. And I'm not sure for the non-native English speakers, this is a childhood phrase that we use, that sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can't hurt me, as a way to say that there are physical things that have a negative impact on us, but words keep us safe or they don't have an impact. And my research is looking at how our internal environment or how the way that we think may have an impact on our risk for dementia, or may be associated with a risk for dementia. I should be careful with my words there. So for those of you who were here yesterday, the start is a little bit of repetition, but then I'll go into the empirical work. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the concept of cognitive debt and repetitive negative thinking within that concept. And then I'll describe an empirical study, or the first empirical study that is examining this, and then to mention briefly some future directions. So as Ulman spoke about earlier, there are psychological or cognitive processes that are associated with a reduction in our vulnerability to the clinical expression of Alzheimer's disease. This is called reserve and is now since expanding out to thinking about resilience and resistance in the face of pathology. And I started to wonder whether there are psychological or cognitive processes that actually increase our vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease. So potentially I am more of the glass half empty viewpoint. I'm not sure, a consequence of being British. I labeled this the idea of cognitive debt, which is on a slightly different axis from these reserve and resilience. I think they can be two separate processes. So as it turns out, there are psychological factors that are associated with increased risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Depression is the most widely studied psychological factor, with 3 meta-analyses now showing or reporting an increased risk of dementia with clinical depression. The second most studied is the personality trait of neuroticism, or a proneness to experience distress, with 2 meta-analyses now supporting the idea of being higher on this personality characteristic is associated with increased risk. And Bob Wilson from Rush University was really the pioneer in this research. And finally, anxiety is another less well-studied psychological factor, but actually in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a great interest in anxiety symptoms and clinical diagnosis of anxiety being associated with an increased risk of dementia. And here you can see one meta-analysis broadly showing that this increased risk. I do want to point out that the perspective that I'm taking is that these psychological factors are risk factors, but there's also the perspective that they are prodromal features of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and this debate is ongoing. I want to mention that neuroticism is slightly different in that it's considered a lifelong trait, and so is far less likely to be a prodromal feature. So I've mentioned these 3 psychological factors, but in fact there are more. Post-traumatic stress disorder is receiving a lot of attention right now, with a couple of systematic reviews and meta-analyses just being published. Sleep disorder, which I know is a very hot topic, so I don't actually want to touch that too much. And also experiencing life stress. And life stress has been associated with this increased risk, and it's often this experience of lack of control which is quite interesting. So what is striking about these psychological factors is that they are highly interrelated. So depression and anxiety are frequently comorbid. If you have high levels of neuroticism, you're more vulnerable to developing PTSD after a stressor, etc. And so it's interesting, as I was hearing you talking about the G factor, actually there's something called the P factor, which is psychopathology. And so this is something in the clinical psychology world is being studied, this psychopathology risk. So I wanted to understand a little bit about how or why these psychological factors are associated with increased risk of dementia. And so in addition to being highly interrelated, they also frequently share a style of thinking. And that style of thinking is called repetitive negative thinking. And I've put this bidirectional arrow because not only is this a feature of each of these psychological factors, but in fact, for example, individuals who have depression, who engage in high levels of repetitive negative thinking, are more likely to have more recurrent episodes of depression and of increasing severity. So there's this kind of circular relationship here. So what is repetitive negative thinking? First of all, it's been described as transdiagnostic, so it is not particular to any one psychological disorder. It encompasses both worry, which are negative thoughts about potential future events. So what if I don't make it to the talk on time? I'm going to miss something. It's going to be catastrophic for my life. And also negative thoughts about past events, so negative memories. So why did I say that to that person? I'm such a fool. I shouldn't have done that. And so it is elaborating on these negative themes. And it actually describes the process rather than the content. That's what's important here. And it's a relatively stable style of thinking and can be sustained outside of conscious awareness. These are all descriptors of it. And a definition that I quite like is self-relevant, persistent thoughts that elaborate on negative themes. So the cognitive debt hypothesis is proposing that it may be repetitive negative thinking that is driving the association between these psychological factors and Alzheimer's disease. And this was quite a difficult hypothesis to test because, first of all, in the cohort studies, nobody has really assessed repetitive negative thinking. And to look at the risk for Alzheimer's disease, you would have to follow them for quite some time. So what we've done is we put these intermediate outcomes, looking at pathology and cognitive decline, and we've given the repetitive negative thinking questionnaire to 2 ongoing studies. So that leads me to the empirical study, which is where we looked to see whether repetitive negative thinking was associated with pathological markers of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid and tau, and whether it's associated with cognitive decline, more so than symptoms of anxiety and depression, these 2 factors that are increasingly established as risks for Alzheimer's disease. So in the first cohort, this was using the Prevent AD cohort in conjunction with my colleague Sylvia Villeneuve, and they have PET amyloid, and we took the global neocortical A-beta index. With tau, we looked at 2 regions of interest known to have early accumulation of tau, the entorhinal cortex and the inferior temporal cortex. And we looked at cognition, which was measured yearly for up to 4 years and includes different domains of immediate and delayed memory, global cognition, spatial cognition, attention, and language, composite measures using the R-bands. We assessed repetitive negative thinking using a validated questionnaire, the 10-item perseverative thinking questionnaire, and depressive symptoms, again, using validated measures, the GDS, and the GAI. There were 113 participants in the neuroimaging study and 292 in the longitudinal cognitive trajectory study. And they're all older adults at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia. In the other cohort, this was using the IMAP plus cohort in collaboration with Gail Chetela. And we used a different amyloid tracer and again a global neocortical amyloid mask. Again, using the repetitive negative thinking questionnaire and 2 different measures of depression and anxiety. And there were 68 participants in this group, again, all cognitively intact. So nobody had dementia or MCI. So first of all, we wanted to look at the relationship between anxiety, depression, and repetitive negative thinking individually in unadjusted models, just to see whether there was a relationship between each of these individual measures and amyloid in these 2 cohorts. And as you can see, repetitive negative thinking was the only measure that was associated with amyloid. So not depression, not anxiety in either of the 2 cohorts. And in both cohorts, repetitive negative thinking was a significant predictor. So then we wanted to test the model a little bit more and control for variables that we know are associated with amyloid aggregation, such as age, ApoE genotype, and MMSE, and then put repetitive negative thinking in there to see whether it remained a significant predictor. And again, in both cohorts, even controlling for these known predictors, repetitive negative thinking was still a significant predictor. And actually, this is supported by a study that came out earlier this year, which was looking at patients who had subjective cognitive decline and using amyloid PET scans. And they asked the participants, do you have memory complaints? And does this worry you? And they looked, okay, so memory complaints, no or yes. And then they've got amyloid on the y-axis. And the memory complaints there was no difference between those who had complaints or who didn't. Whether the complaints or their memory worried them, there was a difference. So participants who were not worried had lower amyloid load than those who were worried. The way that they were conducting this study was actually in the opposite way from the way that I'm framing it, and that they were looking at amyloid predicting worry, but because these are cross-sectional, it's actually, you can look at it in both ways. So that's amyloid. Now looking at tau, and this is only in the Prevent AD cohort. Again, we used the unadjusted models to see whether there were relationships with depression, anxiety, and tau in these 2 regions of interest. And again, only repetitive negative thinking was associated with tau. Not significantly here, but there was a trend, so we took it further and used the adjusted models. It's close, and there was no relationship here. So entorhinal cortex, there's a hint of a relationship. With the inferior temporal cortex, there was no longer a relationship. Now looking at cognitive decline, again, I mentioned we've got these 6 cognitive domains, and we used covariates here. And this is work I want to just mention. It's conducted by a great MSc student of mine, Lisa Loveland. And what she found was actually specific relationship with the 2 measures of memory, immediate memory and delayed memory. So just to explain this a little bit, we've got immediate memory, delayed memory on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and the middle line is actually the average level of repetitive negative thinking seen in the sample. This is 1 standard deviation lower, 1 standard deviation higher. And so you can see that with higher levels of repetitive negative thinking were associated with a a different form of decline in both. So it's worse to have higher levels of repetitive negative thinking. So in summary, I've introduced the concept of cognitive debt. I'm proposing that repetitive negative thinking may be the active ingredient that is driving the association. I've talked about how repetitive negative thinking is associated with amyloid and tau, and also with a steeper level of cognitive decline. And I want to say that at this point, I cannot say anything about causation. These are just associations right now. And we don't know whether repetitive negative thinking is a prodromal feature of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, or whether it may be this independent risk. And this is something that I will be analyzing or looking at in the 1946 birth cohort, which has used, followed participants who were born in 1946. They're now 70 years old, and they gave assessments of worry and rumination at age 36, and they have multiple cognitive assessments. So we can see whether earlier life assessments of worry and rumination may affect cognitive trajectory or may affect risk of developing dementia. But one of the key questions is, could reducing repetitive negative thinking reduce risk for dementia? And this is something that we want to address in the Silver Santé study, where again, we can't directly measure dementia, but we can look at these outcomes of cognition, amyloid and brain volume in the 18-month study. And we can look at cognition and other blood-based biomarkers in the 8-week mindfulness study. And also in another project called Modify, where are recruiting participants who are older adults who have clinically significant anxiety and depression, and looking to see whether known psychological therapies that are offered through the National Health Service may reduce repetitive negative thinking and also improve cognition and also blood-based biomarkers. So with that, I just want to thank the members of the Villeneuve team, Gail Chetela's team, my lab, and the Medit-Aging research group, and obviously my funder.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk. Are there any questions for Natalie? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on the intervention. I mean, one thing would be to reduce negative thinking, right? But would you then reduce thinking per se? I think some models say that it's good to think. It will protect against AD and cellular pathology. Are you replacing it with positive thinking?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's something that I'm increasingly interested in, is could repetitive positive thinking be good, or is it the absence of thought? And one of the measures that we're looking at, actually, you can break it into brooding and reflection. And reflection is believed to be a more positive style of thinking, and so we can start to examine that very question.
I would just add as well that meditation is not stop of thinking, as just being focused about and aware of what you are thinking in the present moment and what you are living and feeling. So it's just a correction for that. It's not that you don't think about anything and don't have any active cognitive activity. So, yeah. But we will know more about that with Antoine's talk.
Yeah, good point, Gail.
Hello. Very nice talk. I just wanted to know how you control for medication, because SSRIs, for example, have been associated with increased risk of dementia and Alzheimer. And if you have a story of recurrent depression and anxiety clinically diagnosed, is likely that you had during your life this medication. So that's my question, how you...
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I know that with IMAP, I believe it's an exclusion criterion to have a diagnosis of depression. Is that right? Yeah. So Gail said there's subclinical levels of depression. So this is why we can assess depressive symptoms, but not clinical depression. With the Prevent AD cohort, they do not exclude individuals with depression. I know that Lisa looked at medication, and I believe in her first analysis, she actually controlled for that, and the results were maintained. But I do agree that medication is an interesting thing to consider. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I'm just curious a bit. I mean, you pointed out that the association so far is just an association and can only be causally interpreted, but we don't have causal data. But now with your intervention, you are actually making a causality claim or testing a causality claim. So I just would like to know, what are the physiological mechanisms through which negative repetitive thinking basically erodes your brain or accumulates tau? I just try to understand how that would actually work.
Yeah. I've been thinking quite a bit about that too. So from the literature, repetitive negative thinking is associated with stress. So chronically elevated levels of stress, and so that would be measured by cortisol. And it's been associated with higher levels of cortisol. Also, it's associated with vascular factors, so higher hypertension, blood pressure. And so it could be acting via a vascular mechanism too. Yeah, and so that's, pardon me? And the resting state, resting state network too. It's associated with activation of the default mode network. And that's something I think we can start to look at in Medit-Aging too. So I'll get back to you.
Have you looked at any correlation between, for example, socioeconomic status and negative thinking?
Not yet, but I think that's a really important thing to look at. Yeah.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker. Please join me in thanking Natalie once more.